Hello and welcome to my video series examining Missing 411 Eastern United States. In this section, we will start the New England chapter, which contains 19 cases. New England will cover the states of New Hampshire, New York, Delaware, Maine, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. However, as usual, we will see Paulides cover cases outside of this region to, quote, show that issues surrounding missing people do not stop at our border, close quote. While I agree that people go missing all over the planet, I fail to see why you'd bother categorizing a geographic location only then to go outside of your defined boundaries. The chapter begins with the usual statement about Paulides not believing in coincidence. For example, Paulides explicitly states that two children who went missing 80 miles and 9 days apart are related, and that this belief is based on common sense because they were both exactly 21 months old at the time. Those two cases were that of Bobby Connor and Claire Bensen. Keep that in mind for when we cover them. They will be at the end of this video. Up first, however, is Horace Marvin Jr. Horace, who was 4 years old at the time, went missing on March 4th, 1907, from Kitchmook, Delaware. Horace's father, Dr. Martin, had just moved here, and his family was from Iowa. Details about the initial disappearance are scarce, but Horace disappeared from his yard shortly after moving into his new home. The search was immediately massive, involving 24-hour searches for a week. The wheat fields owned by the Martins were burned in an attempt to locate him. After 2 weeks, local authorities wanted to terminate the searches, but the Martins wouldn't have it. They reached out to the governor, and eventually, even the Secret Service got involved. Law enforcement was so convinced that he was taken that newspapers reported that he was kidnapped. Exactly 2 months after he went missing, a local hunter found his decomposing body in a bog. The area had been combed dozens of times before this. The coroner reported that there were no broken bones, but there were signs that he was alive for at least 40 hours after he went missing. An article from the Telegraph on May 6, 1907 stated, quote, to reach the spot where the body was found, the boy must have walked across a dozen snow-covered fields in the face of a driving wind, and then climbed 2 high embankments besides crawling through a barbed wire fence, close quote. The official cause of death was listed as exhaustion, but searchers were confused as to why he would have picked that particular spot to lay down. Let's review. Paulides says a lot of times that this case, and specifically the elements within it, don't make sense. But he never says why. He just says that they don't, as if by saying over and over without providing an answer to the argument as to why it doesn't make sense, it will convince his readers anyway. For example, it doesn't make sense that Horace would leave the confines of his farmyard and head into atrocious winter weather and die in the bogs. Okay, well, I get that it's your opinion that that doesn't make sense, but why, to you, does that not make sense? He had just moved there. He didn't know the area. It does make sense that if he chose to go outside, he would get lost. He obviously didn't choose to go out and die. He chose to go outside like young boys often do. Another example. The boy was alive for at least 40 hours after he went missing, but this doesn't make sense. Okay, that's a valid opinion to have, but why do you have that opinion? Should he have died sooner? Later? No explanation as to why that should be strange is given, because in reality, with the facts, it isn't all that strange. Speaking of facts, let's review those. Horace was just under 4 years old at 3 years 10 months, but I don't hold the rounding against him. What is a bit of a typo, though, is that the town's name is Kit's Hammock, according to the newspaper anyway, or Kit's Hummock, according to Google Maps. Either way, it's two separate words, not Kitschmuck. They had moved there less than a week prior. Horace was playing with his sister in some haystacks at about 10 in the morning. She went inside to get something, and when she returned, Horace was gone. She looked for him for about 15 minutes, but when she couldn't find him, she went back inside and alerted her parents. The article quoted makes it sound like a very exhausting journey indeed. However, this place was less than half a mile from his home. In nearly every other case, Missing 411 has listed an estimated distance between the place of disappearance and the place where they were found. But not in this case. This time, the only quote from a news article that's given makes it sound as if Horace tracked across half the county. But no, it was less than half a mile, which suddenly doesn't sound all that far to get for someone nearly 4 years old. As to the final point, searchers were not confused as to why he chose to lay down there. In fact, the prevailing theory is that he didn't choose to lie down at all, but rather he collapsed. As to the cause of death, it was exhaustion and privation. Nowadays, we would say exposure. In fact, the article from the Ashton Gazette reads, quote, "Science solves Martin's case. Science came to the aid of investigators into the mysterious death of 4-year-old Horace Marvin Jr., and lent convincing evidence that the child met his end from exposure on the marshes after wandering away from his home at Kit's Hammock, Delaware, and not at the hands of kidnappers." Close quote. Up next is Elsie M. Davis. Elsie, who was 24 years old at the time, went missing on July 30th, 1911 from Howe Hill, Maine. After Sunday services, in which Elsie was an organist, she went home. Sometime after noon, her parents came in to check on her and found that she was missing. It was felt that she may have wandered off into the woods, so a search began. Footprints were found at first, but no further clues were found for 3 days. A psychic wrote in and said that Elsie was in the trees, and searchers simply needed to look up. On the 5th day, Elsie's personal belongings were found scattered around 3 miles from her home. Later that same day, searchers found Elsie, dazed and confused, 20 feet up in a tree. She was barely clothed and unable to speak. She was unable to recall what had happened for the last 5 days, and only remembered shortly after she reached the woods on the day that she went missing. Doctors said that she was suffering from fever and delirium. Investigators were never able to determine how she lived for 5 days alone in the woods. In the early 1900s, mental illness was not well understood. Some would argue it's not very well understood today. Let's take a little closer look to see if we can determine what's going on here. First of all, she was 22, not 24. And the second point is just completely wrong. She had missed church that day entirely, which is why her parents were concerned. Their immediate thought was that she had committed suicide because she had been so despondent lately. To add to their fears, her father's revolver was missing from its usual place, which is why an immediate search was called to look for a grown woman. As for the psychic, I didn't see any articles which said that the clairvoyant claimed that she would be in a tree. But Elsie was found in an area where a psychic from Portland said she would be found in. As for the scattered belongings, Elsie herself had put them out there in order to dry. She was found in a tree because a bloodhound had treed her. Oh, right. Missing 411 doesn't mention this, but a bloodhound was able to track her right to her exact location. She was initially unable to speak, but she did end up recovering her memory and said that she went for a walk into the woods and became lost. The more she tried to find her way out, the deeper into the woods that she got. She persisted on berries and slept on tree boughs. Up next is Edward Teddy Gately. Edward, who was 2 years old at the time, went missing on October 27th, 1917, from Brighton, Massachusetts. Edward's mother left him alone on the back porch with an apple for a few minutes. When she returned, he was gone. A thunderstorm hit that night and wiped out all the tracks of the child. The next morning at 6:30 a.m., a police sergeant was searching a vacant lot around a quarry and heard Edward calling out, "Mama." He was naked and blue from exposure. His clothes were in a pile nearby, drenched from the heavy rainstorm the previous night. He was hospitalized for 2 days. His parents were adamant that he could not dress himself or remove his clothing. Pilates boldly states, quote, "It's apparent from this case that someone took Teddy, moved him, stripped him of his clothes, and then gently placed him under the cover of bushes. There was never a mention of molestation, so the question is, why were his clothes removed?" Close quote. I'd like to make a few points here before we move on to the actual review. First, if you've been a regular watcher of this series, we all know by now that it is exceedingly common for children to remove their clothes, especially when the clothes are soiled, uncomfortable, or when the child is tired. Secondly, I will quote Kenneth Poland, MD, a pediatrician in Chicago. Quote, "Around 18 months of age, and sometimes even younger, toddlers will start undressing themselves because it doesn't require as much skill. They're like little Houdinis, and they can get out of anything. Parents shouldn't be surprised to walk into their child's bedroom in the morning and find her with nothing on." Close quote. Let's review the facts with all that in mind. When Edward went missing, he was playing with another child at the time. For the third point, we find out why Pilates failed to mention his usual quote of, "A search was launched immediately." That's because in this case, it definitely wasn't. The mother searched on her own and didn't ask anyone for help. After quite some time, her neighbors spotted her and saw that she was in trouble, and at that time they offered to help. As for the thunderstorm, it happened shortly before midnight, which means that it was more than 12 hours later. As for Edward's condition when he was found, he had a high fever, but doctors on the 29th said that they thought that he would live. I didn't see any information about a specific day that he was released. As for the parents' thoughts, there's some important context that explains why the parents felt the way that they did. In the same article that is quoted in the book, the parents go on to clarify what they think happened. Quote, "Mrs. Gately told of a case last night where a child was taken into a hut by some boys about a year ago in the early winter, stripped of its clothing and sent out into the cold." Close quote. That is, the parents thought that some boys were playing a dangerous prank that went too far. They also believe that due to his shoes being tied very tight and one of the garments buttoning up the back, they believe it would have been impossible for Edward to have removed these articles of clothing himself. Whether it actually was impossible or not, that's difficult to say. For the final point, it's apparent, again from the article that Pilates quoted, that doctors knew that he spent all night out in the cold. So, the kidnapper takes one child but not the other, remember that he was playing with somebody else at the time, holds him captive until dark, strips him, releases him completely unharmed into a storm, throws all of his clothes out in a pile as well, and then Edward just stays there motionless until he's found. Given all of the facts, what do you think happened to him? Was he abducted, as Pilates claims? Did he wander off and become a victim of some neighborhood bullies? Or was he perhaps more adept at removing his own clothing, given enough time, than even his parents believed? Up next is David Brown and Mertley Johnson. David, who was 51 years old at the time, and Mertley, who was 24 years old at the time, went missing on November 18, 1922, from Big Bog Dam, Maine. David and Mertley were game wardens, investigating the disappearances of beavers in their area. They had been hand-picked by the chief game warden due to their experience. They were last seen at DeRoche's halfway camp on November 14th, but both were known to have left that camp by the 18th. When they didn't return to the office, a search was launched. All of the articles specifically stated how knowledgeable Brown and Johnson were, and they were known for their professionalism. Their boss, Commissioner Parsons, made it clear that he thought that they were killed by Canadian poachers, whom he believed were responsible for the beaver disappearances. Several shots were heard by witnesses from the area where the wardens were last seen. This is the same area where poachers were believed to have been. On May 2nd of the next year, during the spring thaw, witnesses reported a body stuck in the spillway of the dam. This body was identified as Mertley Johnson. David Brown's body was found the next day, about 1 mile below where Mertley's body was found. The cause of death was determined by 2 medical examiners. They believed that they had died from drowning, and no bullet wounds were found. Pilates finishes off this case with an incredible display of faulty logic and theory spinning. The highlights being that since the bodies were found within 24 hours of each other, well, that means that they died simultaneously. While I do agree that they likely drowned at the same time, I don't see how finding a body within a certain time frame would affect anything. If David's body hadn't been found for another week, but had been in the same place, would Pilates have said that they died separately because it took longer to find David's body? He says repeatedly that these 2 wardens were far too knowledgeable and too professional to have drowned. As if professionalism prevents a cold water gasp, a mammalian diving reflex which causes an involuntary gasp when you're submerged in cold water. He rounds off this rambling by putting forward a not-so-subtle Bigfoot illusion. Quote, "The shooting of bullets in rapid succession is proof that these 2 wardens confronted a very dangerous predator and lost," close quote. Then he goes on to say that the same predator, i.e. Bigfoot, was also responsible for the beaver disappearances. That's enough pointing out the obvious. Or, well, no it isn't, but let's take a look at the facts anyway. In a way, they were both picked by the chief game warden, considering that David was the chief game warden of that area. None of the articles I read specifically stated any overwhelming praise for these men. Yes, they were smart and they were good at their jobs, but Pilates is laying it on so thick, it's an obvious attempt to make the death by misadventure seem out of the question. Nobody, though, is above making mistakes. There was some excellent evidence for there being Canadian poachers in the area, as Mertley himself had confronted one of them. A November 17th article stated that Mertley had found a truck of a Canadian hunter whom he believed was in possession of illegal beaver skins. The Canadian booked it from the truck, leaving behind a pack which contained 10 beaver skins. And since poaching was indeed rampant in this area, it's not unreasonable to think that shots would be heard from time to time. Finally, as for the autopsy finding that they drowned, that's technically true, but they found a little bit more than that. The autopsy specifically stated that there were no marks of violence. If you'll indulge me for a moment, how would a predator, Bigfoot or otherwise, gently drown 2 men while being shot? It's so ridiculous, and it's an insult to these 2 men's memory to use their deaths to further a Bigfoot obsession. The investigation concluded that one of the men fell out of a canoe, and the other drowned as well when trying to help. Anyone who has been in a canoe would know how easy it is to tip one over, especially when trying to retrieve someone who has already fallen out. By the way, 3 clairvoyants called in, and they all claimed that the 2 wardens would be found in a camp, one of whom would be injured in the stomach. Funny how Pilates forgets to mention that. I suppose it's only worth mentioning in Missing 411 if the wild guesses of supposed clairvoyants turn out to be accurate. Up next is Kenneth Swanson. Kenneth, who was 2 years old at the time, went missing on August 24, 1930, from Colebrook, Connecticut. Kenneth was at his grandparents' house, playing in the front yard alone with his pet dog. When his mother called him in, she noticed that both he and the dog were missing. The police were quickly called and a search began. The dog returned without Kenneth around midnight a day later. Bloodhounds could not pick up the scent, or they refused to track. 2 months after Kenneth went missing, a hunter found his body about 2 miles from his grandparents' home. There were very few details about the condition of the body, besides that it was decomposed. A coroner did an autopsy and determined that there were no broken bones or signs of violence. To law enforcement, this scenario did not make any sense, though nothing of evidentiary value was located at the scene. Kenneth's grandparents were so distraught over this that they left the area and never returned. Let's review. Of interest, there is supposedly a talking ghost in an old barn that once spoke about Kenneth, saying that he would be found in a cellar. It's not really pertinent to anything, I just thought it was pretty interesting. For the first point, it was noted that Kenneth was very large for his age, so large in fact that he could have been mistaken for a 5-year-old. I only mention this because it may help explain the 2-mile distance a little bit better, but yes, the information in the book is correct. As of the condition of the body where it was found, it was noted that it was in a thicket. One article stated that the thicket was so dense that the hunter would not have seen the body at all, except he was looking for a bird that he had shot. As for law enforcement, it seems to have made perfect sense to them. It was stated repeatedly in different articles that the kidnapping theory was proven wrong, and the case was closed with the determination that he had wandered away and died of exposure. Up next is Alden Johnson. Alden, who was 4 years old at the time, went missing on March 27, 1934, from North Rehoboth, Massachusetts. Alden was playing in the side yard of his home with his sister and another friend when a thunderstorm hit, and Alden's mother called for the children to come home. Alden did not come inside. His mother searched for about 10 minutes, and then she called police. Within hours, the area was being scoured by hundreds of searchers. Bloodhounds were brought in, but they couldn't pick up the scent. 26 hours into the search, Alden was found dazed but alive by a search party in a swamp more than 2 miles away. Alden fell unconscious by the time he was returned, and he was sent to the hospital where he stayed for 2 days. He had scratches on his face and arms and was wet from the waist down. Quote, "No mention was ever made that he was cold or freezing," close quote. Let's review. Alden went missing on the 26th, not the 27th, and he wasn't dazed when he was found, since he announced to the searchers that found him, quote, "I've been picking flowers," close quote. Even the Boston Globe, which Pilates quotes, says that the boy was unbothered and in good spirits. He tried to sell these flowers to those around him. I didn't see an article that stated that he stayed in a hospital for 2 days. Indeed, it was mentioned that he was in good health, though he did faint when he returned home initially. As for him being wet from the waist down, he was wet from the rain, so all over. As for the being cold or freezing, the very article that Pilates quotes does in fact mention that Alden was, quote, "wet and cold," close quote. Further, mention was made about how he kept generally warm. He was wearing a ski suit. Up next is Bobby Connor. Bobby, who was 21 months old at the time, went missing on July 13th, 1934, from Greenburgh, New York. Bobby was playing with an older neighborhood friend when the friend's mother called him in. The friend told Bobby to go home, but Bobby stopped to play in a sandpile. The friend noticed this and notified Bobby's mother that she would have to go and get him, but when she did, Bobby was gone. Bobby's parents searched until dark, and then they notified police. Bloodhounds were brought in, but they could not pick up the scent. As the days went on, police thought that he could not have survived the weather, and, quote, continued to privately think that the boy was kidnapped, close quote. 5 days later, Bobby was found on his back under brambles about 3/4 of a mile away from his house, in an area that had been searched many times before. He was groggy, but alive. Police stated that they believed that Bobby had been abducted and then freed. Doctors said that Bobby had severe cuts on his face and was suffering from a fever. His shoes were off, and one was high up in a bush, which officers could not explain. There were no mosquito bites or sunburns, which added to the abduction theory. Let's review. His parents didn't search much at all. They waited until dark because they weren't really alarmed at first. Quote, frequently, the children had strayed about the thickets and had become lost for some short time, close quote. Seems a little bit blasé to me, but different times, I suppose. People were indeed arrested under suspicion of kidnapping, but they were released as soon as Bobby was found. The abduction theory wasn't a private theory for police. They were publicly investigating the kidnapping angle. As for the area being searched many times before, it wasn't. In fact, this specific spot was omitted from searches because officials thought it was too far away. Within a couple of days of Bobby being found, it was determined that there was no kidnapping and he'd gotten to where he was under his own power. As for the scratches, he also had scratches over the rest of his body, as well as bruises, and again, the kidnapping theory was abandoned. In addition, he was wearing a sunsuit, which would have prevented the worst of sunburns. The final nail in the coffin is this. When the mother was asked if she thought that he was kidnapped, this was her response. Quote, I don't think anyone had any special motive. We have no enemies. He could walk as far as the place where he was found, but not through those bushes, unless he walked on the road. Close quote. Up next is Claire Bensen. Claire, who was 21 months old at the time, went missing on July 24th, 1934, from Cromwell, Connecticut. Claire was playing by herself in the backyard while her mother did some chores inside. When her mother checked on her, she was gone. Police and bloodhounds arrived and began to search. A bloodhound tracked her scent within 20 feet of her, but she either wasn't there at the time or the handler didn't see her. Hours later, another searcher checked that area and found Claire sitting naked on a patch of moss in a swamp about 2 miles from her home. She was thankfully still alive. Her sunsuit was never found. Next, we have a list of similarities between this case and the previous one. In both cases, they were 21 months old. They both lived near swamps. They both were found in areas where searchers couldn't understand how they got there. They were both missing clothing, and they were both found in an area that was previously searched. Let's review. To be fair to Missing 411, the name was indeed reported as Claire Bensen in one article. However, all other articles refer to her under her correct name, Claire Bernsen. Her mother was not doing chores inside. She had left her children while she went out to pick berries. The mother, at the time, believed that Claire had left the house to go look for her, since she knew the general direction of where she had gone. And lastly, her sunsuit was found. It was about half a mile down a county road. In fact, this is what was used by bloodhounds to aid in the search for her. In review of how the cases are similar, I'm actually willing to admit that there are some similarities. However, that doesn't mean anything. When we look at the similarities, we see that both were 21 months old, sure, but children of all ages go missing. Both live near swamps, but as do a great many of these cases. Both were found in areas where searchers couldn't understand how they got there. Well, this point isn't really true. Yes, searchers didn't think that at first they could go that far, but both realized that that was a mistake and they rectified this and eventually found the children. Both of these children were missing clothing, but as are most. Bobby, however, was only missing his footwear, while Claire had removed her entire sunsuit. And finally, for the point about the areas they were both found in being searched before, well, that's not really true. For Bobby, that area was not searched before, and for Claire, the search was called off just before the handler got to her. So we see that the similarities can be applied to most missing children cases. Does this mean that they are all related? Oh, I'm sure that that's exactly what Paulides would claim. However, I would argue that these are just common elements that appear due to how children typically behave. That is, they tend to remove their clothing, they tend to get a little bit further than searchers expect them to, and they tend to be difficult to find as they tend to climb into thickets and under bushes. So, these cases, in my personal opinion, are only related as far as they are both cases of missing children of the same age, who, wouldn't you know it, behaved in similar ways. Another way to address this issue of the cases being similar and thus related are to look at how these two cases are dissimilar. Bobby was a boy and Claire was a girl. Bobby was found with his clothes. Claire was naked. Bobby was found in a bush near a man-made wall. Claire was found on a bed of moss in a swamp. Bobby didn't have a sunburn or serious bug bites. Claire had both. Bobby was missing for several days. Claire was only missing for one. Bobby couldn't be tracked by bloodhounds. Claire was tracked by bloodhounds very effectively. Bobby was playing in another lot when he went missing. Claire went missing from her own yard. Bobby's parents didn't look for him right away. Claire's parents did. Bobby went missing from New York. Claire went missing from Connecticut. The final point I want to make in this video is this. Coincidences happen. You can choose not to believe in them all you want, but that's how you get a book filled with factual inaccuracies. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this entire video, if you've made it this far. We are fast approaching the end of the book. After we finish off New England next time, Vermont and New Jersey will follow. I may or may not have a short final video to wrap up my thoughts after that, but until then, take care.